Hey everybody, I'm Maya. I am a second year medical student, so it's been fantastic to learn a lot of humanities from you all these last couple of days. I'm interested in pursuing aerospace medicine. I've done a lot of past work in astrobiology. I also have a creative writing background, particularly in speculative fiction and science fiction. So when I met Eric, the kind of ideas we were tossing around were the scenario that kind of led to this presentation I'm making here, which is centered around medical ethics and Star Trek's Prime Directive. So the scenario we discussed between the two of us is that you have a medical doctor on a ship from Earth, and they're at this planet, they see this other extraterrestrial civilization with a largely understood biology. Of course, there's some unknowns that we can't always pin down, but they have this disease, this problem that is really impacting them. It's going to be a real threat to their survival, and we on Earth, on that ship that we're on, we have the technology to be able to address that issue for them. Their level of technology is maybe such around uncontacted peoples on Earth today, some tribes living in the Amazon and Southeast Asian Ocean. They are intelligent, but they maybe don't have the same level of technology that we have right now. So what do we do? We have a couple of principles at play here. One is Star Trek's Prime Directive, so I do have to admit to being more a Star Wars person myself, but my understanding of the Prime Directive here is that the Star Fleet is not allowed to interfere in the development of pre-warp drive societies, so that's including by introducing a new level of technology or knowledge, which is what we would end up doing here if we were to intervene. And this is also a principle that's practiced by anthropologists that contact these tribes and peoples that are living apart from the rest of society today. They tend to observe rather than to intervene. But then we also have the Hippocratic Oath. So that is what I was educated in and brought up with. And you probably all know the part where it says, first do no harm, but there is also this principle here, into whatsoever houses I enter, I will enter to help the sick. So people still abide by this in medical school and medical training today. We say we want to help people. That is our main goal here. So in this case, you have this extraterrestrial civilization. You have a problem that you can fix, but you have these two principles in conflict here. So Prime Directive tells you to stay out, the Hippocratic Oath tells you to intervene. So now we have a classical moral dilemma. So let's kind of dig into a little bit of the ethical frameworks that surround these two principles. Keeping in mind you have the medical student here, not the ethicist, but I'll do my best. So the Prime Directive here, a lot of the thought around it sort of attributes this principle to the framework of cultural relativism, which does state that the values come from within a culture and there's no objective right and wrong per se, there's no universal standard. Which can be extremely fraught, as many of you I think might agree. It kind of goes against the idea of universal human rights or personal rights, as we might say with this extraterrestrial civilization, and it can lead to some pretty absurd conclusions, which is like saying, the final solution would be appropriate within the context of Nazi Germany, which is not super valid. So we can maybe go to a weaker version of cultural relativism to serve as the basis for the Prime Directive here, and that might state something like, circumstances can make some actions permissible when other situations they would not be, so maybe staying out in this case would be what's best for this civilization in the long run. So when we go over to the Hippocratic Oath, we can align that more with deontological ethics, which states that an act can be right or wrong independent of its consequences, and that motive is really important here. So we are assuming that the crew has a good motive. They want to help, they want to do some good for this civilization. But then we also have to evaluate kind of active interference versus omission of action. So not helping those in need would be judged a little bit less stringently than actively doing harm. Kind of get back to the first do no harm principle. And so we have to kind of take a historical perspective here and really consider that when we have interactions between more technologically advanced and less technologically advanced societies, that often comes off really badly for the less technologically advanced societies in history, when we think about European colonization of the Americas, and even today, when we have these uncontacted tribes making contact with people from global society, you have hundreds of people that die of things like the common cold, which I'm clearly bringing to the table today. It's not going to kill me, but for folks in those situations, it can be absolutely devastating for them. So in one read of this situation, we could boil it down to choose between not helping and not harming, because we don't know exactly what the impacts of our actions will be. But if the intent is good, as we assume it is, deontology could tell us to step in regardless. So you have here a little bit of double effect, where you have a good, well-intentioned action that might have both good and bad consequences. So with these two principles in conflict, Eric and I kind of turn to utilitarianism to break the tie. And that says what matters here are purely the consequences. So let's do the highest amount of good for the highest number of individuals. It's not culturally relative, and in certain situations it could lead us to go around the prime directive here. But then we kind of circle back, because we could take the prime directive to be based on a sort of form of rule utilitarianism, which says that you have to evaluate, okay, what is going to be better, always following the prime directive or never following the prime directive, and stick to which one will do the maximum amount of good. But the problem with that is that we don't know which one will do the most good here. So, to recap where we've gone so far, we have in this scenario a potential to do a lot of good, to really do a life-saving and society-saving action for this extraterrestrial civilization. But you also have an equal or even greater potential for harm. We just don't know what the impacts of our intervention are going to end up being. And so to evaluate what that might look like, we have a couple of ethical frameworks that could be in conflict. And we kind of concluded here at this branch point that a lot is just context dependent. And so utilitarianism offers a way for us to evaluate these different contexts and hopefully see a path forward there. Oops, you got the spoiler there. So we would identified a few key decision points that kind of we evaluated through the lens of utilitarianism. First, this might seem super simple, but what we should know is the civilization asking for help? Do they want us to intervene and give them this technology that might save them? And you might think, and what my first thought is that utilitarianism might not really care whether they're asking for help. If the impact of your action is the same, regardless of whether they ask for it, that may just be, not something you might not need to evaluate. But the lives saved are only one part of this equation. So we need to weigh more than that in terms of the total good that this action might do, because you're thinking about our future relationship with the society, the cultural impacts that saving these aliens might have. So there's more than just that, and that kind of comes back to are they asking for help? So if they are asking for help, we need to evaluate who's the one doing the asking. I think it's very interesting in science fiction that I feel like we have a lot of representations of worlds that are governed by one entity. They're like the ice planet hot. It's one bio, it's one entity, it's one thing. But we see on Earth that that's simply, it's likely not true. We have different biomes, we have different governments, we have different societies, even within this one planet that we all live on. And so you have to ask, who is asking for help? Is one country asking and one is not? Is one faction within the nation asking for help and the wider government is not? It's a question we need to consider here, because helping one and not another could drastically change the power balance within a society. I think there actually is a Star Trek episode in which a crew circumvents the Prime Directive, supplies weapons to one faction of a society on this planet, completely devastates the rest of the planet. It has these very far-reaching impacts here. So if one faction is asking and another is not, we then have to go to the no side of this equation to evaluate the impacts of how that's going to look. So then I kind of get back to my area here. We need to, if the society is declining assistance, we need to ensure that they actually are providing informed consent here. So we have Applebaum's framework, Applebaum's criteria for informed consent, that folks need to actually be able to provide informed consent. You have to be able to communicate your choice, understand the information given, appreciate the situation and its consequences, and explain your reasoning. And so if you satisfy those, as in maybe a case of a Jehovah's Witness declining a blood transfusion, they understand what's going to happen to them if they don't have the transfusion, but they still can communicate that this is not what I want, I choose not to have this. And so, that is an absolutely rational choice. It's maybe not what you would choose, but it is something that you need to respect. And so if you confirm that this civilization is giving informed consent, we need to move on to a framework of shared decision-making, which is something we practice every day in medicine. Some folks don't like certain medications, they don't want to do certain interventions. We have to figure out, okay, what is going to be good for you? Is there a more palatable solution we can arrive at, even if it's less effective? Jehovah's Witnesses, we have this whole field of bloodless medicine. So we give these folks iron, we give them hormones that make them produce more red blood cells. It's not as effective as a blood transfusion, but it is something that can help them and is palatable to them, and you get more utilitarianism out of it. You get greater good than whether you did nothing at all. So then you have the point of, what if there are those within this nation state that want help, even if their government declines? I think it's pretty common to disagree with your government in certain instances. And so you have to balance the conflict you create with that governing body to the good you can do with the lives of the individuals you might save. The last question I have here is, do we help children, immature members of this society, over their parents' objections? So in our society, we say that children cannot consent for themselves. They are not able to provide informed consent. And so we rely on the principle of harm. If the parent's preference increases the probability of significant and imminent harm to the child, we have to intervene. If a Jehovah's Witnesses child, if a parent's declining a blood transfusion in a trauma setting, we do override that. We provide blood and we save the child's life. In this case, I think with children, we have to be a little bit more cautious because they're not the ones providing the consent, and you accept a little bit more of the risk. So I think my threshold for providing that intervention would be higher, because you need to be very confident in what your intervention will do in order to say that it will do good here. So the second decision point here is evaluating whether we're going to create a dependency of this civilization on Earth. Are they going to need us for technology or interventions, and does that compromise their cultural autonomy? And that kind of depends on what exactly the disease is and what the intervention is necessarily. So when we think about communicable disease and even certain lifestyle diseases, those are based on informational interventions. So we tell you, if you're sick, stay home. If you have a waterborne disease, boil the water. And that's information that can be disseminated quite easily and has less harm, because ultimately the individual is the one taking on that action. And so that has less of a dependency creation, because that's word of mouth, that's information that's passing between individuals and between generations. But if you think about something like a medication, especially something that needs a level of technology to produce that this civilization doesn't have, that's something that you are creating more of a dependency on. You are saying this society needs Earth interventions, it needs Earth technology for at least a certain amount of time in order to continue surviving. And then I think in this case, you need to evaluate your cultural knowledge. What does this society value? Do they value autonomy over survival, and to what degree? And so you kind of get back to shared decision making there, and you say, okay, let's come to a shared conclusion. Would you rather be dependent on us, as all people are, all nations in the world are dependent on each other to some extent? Would you rather have that and survive, or would you rather stay independent and possibly perish? That is ultimately to be left up to society itself. So, to me, it depends. There's no good right answer to this question, which is frustrating for someone that likes to think very algorithmically, especially in medicine. But there's no most right thing to do. We can conclude here that rural utilitarianism, whether we totally follow the Prime Directive or not, is ultimately very flawed, because there is so much dependent on the context of the situation. There's no one-size-fits-all answer here, which is often the case in medicine and in life. So we see this played out in Star Trek itself, where the strict edicts of the Prime Directive, they're not honestly that narratively interesting. So rather than this being a end-all be-all law, we see this violated all the time. There are different crews that choose to step in different situations, and we see the consequences of that play out in a very narratively interesting place. So I just wanted to conclude on this quote from one of our sources that says, ultimately, all the Prime Directive can teach is that when two worlds collide, people must work together to preserve the best of both. Thank you so much.